morning, everyone. Good morning to our attendees and all our delegates that are joining in. I see a lot of happy hellos and chats in the group, in the chat function. Thank you very much. It's always divine to have everyone join us for an IoDSA webinar. I'm going to quickly ask our panelists to please turn on their cameras before we start. And it's great to see someone from St. Helena Bay. Great. I'm so happy that everyone is joining in and we have a good turnout. We had a full registration this morning for this morning's event. So thank you very much. And I love the dedication to the Social and Ethics Committee information sharing session. We've got a full agenda today, and I'm just going to quickly go through a few house rules with everyone. We have a Q&A, a question and answers box for you to please post any questions in when we come to it. I'm going to pop up the agenda in a second when we're sharing. I think I might actually be able to do that now so you can see the order of events. And we will, there we go. We will be doing, there's the agenda. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, and then we will start with our social ethics event, social ethics committee event. Okay, so questions go in the Q&A. You're welcome to chat and comment in the comment section in the comment block. When we come to the Q&A session, we will possibly open it up for some live questions if anybody wants to verbalize their question instead of typing it, and then we will field questions from there. We've got a great panel lined up today. We've got Professor Dion Rousseau. He's the chairperson of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum. He will speak about the Social and Ethics Committee Forum in a second as part of the lineup. He's also a member of the King Committee, as well as a charter director and author of the Social and Ethics Committee Handbook, and as well as the CEO of the Ethics Institute. Then one of our co-authors on this paper, Sue Lund. Sue is also a charter director, a member of the Social and Ethics Committee, and an experienced non-executive director and executive leader. So welcome, Sue. And Shepherd Shoniwa is a non-executive director on various companies, and in those roles, he has been both a chairperson and a committee member of the Social and Ethics Committees. So you can see we've got great experience, technical knowledge from Sue, and experience from within the forum. And then we've got some non-executive director experiences that will be shared by Shepherd, and then rounding it all up with his overall knowledge will be Dion with his depth of knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to kick off by handing the floor over to Dion. This is a little bit about the Social and Ethics Committee Forum. I will stop sharing the slides in a second so we don't detract from the speakers. Oh, actually, I'll keep those up until as long as we need them, and then take them down when we do the Q&A. Okay. Welcome, everybody, and enjoy. Dion, over to you.
Thanks, Julie, and a very good morning here from Pretoria. I saw some of the participants mention that the sun is shining in Joburg, which is quite rare these days. We had a lot of rain over the last weekend. So great to connect with you from all over the country. I saw in the chat people connecting from all parts of the country and even from our neighboring countries, from Gaborone and other places as well. So we look forward to the launch of this paper this morning about the repositioning of the Social and Ethics Committee. It's a paper produced by the Social and Ethics Committee Forum of the IoD. It's a joint forum from the IoD, supported and endorsed by the Ethics Institute. And the whole purpose of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum is to provide a platform for discussing developments that might impact the effectiveness and the role of the Social and Ethics Committee. But at the same time, the Social and Ethics Committee Forum also develops guidance for social and ethics committees to help them to improve their impact and their effectiveness. Now, this forum was formally started just about at the time when we were struck by COVID in 2020. So we have met on a quarterly basis ever since, but never in person. So it is a virtual forum. But up till now, we've done a number of things at the forum. The first one is to introduce in 2020 the annual Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey. I'm sure the IOD will post the link to those trend surveys for us in the chat, so if you want to go there. But the 2020 Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey really provided us with a baseline. And in that trend survey, we looked at all aspects around social and ethics committees, how they are compiled, how many executive, non-executive directors are there, how many members are there, how often do they meet, what do they spend most of their time on, what do they spend least of their time on, but also what are the challenges faced by social and ethics committee in terms of legitimacy and impact. Last year in 2021, we did the second one, and then we could start looking for trends based on the baseline that we set in 2020. Another product that was produced by the Social and Ethics Committee Forum is a template for drafting the terms of reference or a charter for a Social and Ethics Committee, and that link will also be made available to you if you are interested in that. But then we also started developing guidance papers to assist Social and Ethics Committee to improve their impact and effectiveness, or to deal with specifically challenging areas that they might engage. And I'm very excited this morning to launch the first of these guidance papers, the one on the repositioning of the Social and Ethics Committee. Just by way of introduction, when we say the repositioning of the Social and Ethics Committee, it implies that certain things has happened that requires a rethinking of how we position the Social and Ethics Committee within our broader governance landscape. We are, I think, all very well aware that just about a decade ago, on the 1st of May 2012, the requirement in the Companies Act and companies regulations for certain categories of companies to have social and ethics committees became effective. And that was the start of the journey of the Social and Ethics Committee. It's a statutory committee required for certain categories of companies. But if we look at the mandate, the statutory mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee, it basically has a compliance mandate. The committee should monitor compliance against certain legal standards, but also against certain codes of best practice, and then report whether the company comply or not. Now, the second milestone in this evolution of the Social and Ethics Committee was in 2016, when King 4 was published. And King 4 made a number of very important recommendations regarding social and ethics committees. Number one, it expanded the mandate of, or it recommended that the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee be expanded to also include organizational ethics, which was left out in the statutory mandate. Furthermore, it also said that the Social and Ethics Committee should play much more of a governance role, and not only a monitoring compliance role, but a full governance role when it comes to the social and ethics performance of organizations. And furthermore, King 4 also recommended that not only those companies indicated by the Companies Act that should have a Social and Ethics Committee should govern their social and ethics performance, but in fact all organizations, irrespective of how you're incorporated, whether you're listed, non-listed, for-profit, not-for-profit, all organizations always has a social and ethics impact, and that should be governed. So in that sense, King 4 really advanced the whole agenda of what Social and Ethics Committees should do. Last year, we saw the King Committee issuing also a practice note for social and ethics committees, further emphasizing the governance role of the Social and Ethics Committee and how this committee fits in within the broader governance landscape of an organization. Towards the end of last year, we saw the publication of the Companies Amendment Bill, which also made it quite clear that government is quite serious about improving the profile, the impact, and the legitimacy of social and ethics committees. And as all these developments occurred, we had a pandemic in the background, we have the emerging climate crisis that is playing out at an alarming speed around us. And all of these things you can see change the landscape quite radically from what we had on the 1st of May 2012 to where we stand today, almost 10 years later. And that is why I'm very excited to introduce a fellow member of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum, Sue Lund, very experienced on both the executive and the non-executive director side, and someone with deep knowledge of sustainability in general, but also specifically the role that the Social and Ethics Committee can play. Sue is the co-author of this guidance paper. And with that, Sue, I hand over to you to give us an overview of this first guidance paper issued by the Social and Ethics Committee Forum. Thank you. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Dion, and good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you all for making time to go through this guidance paper with us today. Julie, if you could just move the slide on to the first part of the presentation. Thank you. So just I think Dion has set a very clear context for the work that we put together in this paper. But the context is really based on an increasing understanding, I think, amongst all of us, that companies must create more than wealth, that we have an obligation to create value for our society in general, for the economy, for our employees, and of course for the environment. Now, you know, that's common cause, and I think many companies are grappling with how that translates into the practical day-to-day realities of governing an organization. Now, increasingly, and we see this through the results of surveys and the results of our companies that are published, that where companies are proactive in their strategies around environmental, social, and governance matters, it comes through in their performance, in the efficiencies, in the risk management, and in fact, increasingly in lowering the costs of borrowing, which is really reflective of the attention that is given to companies' impact on the environment. So this responsibility of carrying this wider mandate forward is increasingly sitting on the shoulders of the Social and Ethics Committee to lead. And that responsibility is really quite an enormous one. And I know that many social and ethics committees grapple with how they're to structure their work. And so this is what really occupied the minds of our Social and Ethics Committee Forum at the IoD last year. And we said, you know, how can we look to strengthen the role of the SECs to better fulfill this very complex role? So when you have a look at this guidance paper, you'll see that it is really structured in three sections. The first is why an SEC should be established, and I think Dion has touched on that to some extent, and I'll just go through some of those key points very quickly. What an SEC should focus on, and then really some practical guidance on how to enhance the profile and the contribution of SECs to organizational value. Now, I think many people will know that SECs are sometimes named differently in some companies, but that really doesn't matter. And we've just we've used the SEC term generically, but to apply to all those committees that carry out the similar functions that are prescribed for an SEC. So we have laws, standards, and guidelines, and as Dion said, many of these really point to a compliance role. But I think it's worth remembering that in South Africa, it's our Bill of Rights that is the legal foundation of the mandate of the SEC. And it's worth remembering that because it really speaks to citizens' rights to equality, dignity, quality of life, including to a safe and healthy environment. And our obligations as companies, as organizations, is to uphold that Bill of Rights in the final instance. The Companies Act, of course, also then provides that companies must promote the development of the economy by encouraging transparency and high standards of corporate governance, that given the significant role that enterprises play within our social and economic life as a nation. Then Section 72, read with the Regulation 43, provides for the establishment of social and ethics committees. And it is for companies with a public interest score of 500 points in 2 of the previous five years. And then there are specific linkages made in that regulation to relevant local legislation and global principles. So that's the legal foundation. And then, of course, we've got various standards and guidelines. Dion pointed to King 4, which provides a great deal of guidance on the need and role of the SEC. And the ISO standards are also quite important in respect of corporate responsibility, in ensuring that an organization considers in its decision-making the impact that it will have on society and the environment. Then, of course, all of us know the extensive global reporting standards and guidelines that require companies to demonstrate the value that they create for stakeholders in all of these social, economic, and environmental factors. So why do we have an SEC? And in practice, I think the compliance factor is one thing, but in reality, SECs are being faced with quite complex matters to navigate. And our COVID pandemic of the last few years has really pushed this to the forefront, because all of our companies had to respond quickly, fairly, ethically, and responsibly to the significant challenges that were faced by our employees, our suppliers, our customers, and our communities. And we still had to keep these businesses afloat. So there were some very tough decisions that had to be made. And I know many SECs that grappled with the balance between the impact of this pandemic on the companies and its revenue streams, its customers, and then to ensure that its employees were safe and compliant with the regulations. And also had to make various trade-offs on its own policies in respect of how it was going to keep its employee base as safe as possible from the pandemic. So it required a great deal of integrated thinking, and it requires strategy. So an SEC is very far from just a compliance function. It is, in fact, much more, and increasingly so, a strategic role of the board. So, as I mentioned, the statutory functions are very clear, that the SEC must monitor the company's activities in respect of social and economic development, good corporate citizenship, the environment, health and public safety, consumer relations, labor, and employment. So there is a very big compliance and monitoring function that an SEC must perform. That it must report to the board on these matters and keep the board as a whole informed, and it must report to shareholders at the annual general meeting. These are statutory requirements, and they are, in fact, quite significant requirements. Interestingly, with the draft amendments to the Companies Act, the draft as it stands at the moment provides that the minister may prescribe the minimum qualifications for SEC members, that the SEC annual report must be approved by ordinary resolution of shareholders. It's not just a report for noting, it must be approved. And if it's not approved, the SEC must engage the dissenting shareholders and publish steps taken to address their concerns. So it's very interesting that in terms of law, the duty and obligation on the SEC is going to become even more significant if these amendments go through. King 4, of course, notes that the role of the SEC is oversight and reporting on ethics, corporate citizenship, sustainable development, and stakeholder relationships. And it recommends that the majority of SEC members be non-exec directors to ensure independent judgment. So what about these wider functions of the SEC? And I think it's really true to say that the SEC has evolved significantly since its initial statutory inception. And it's evolved from legal compliance to becoming a much more proactive driver of the company's social, economic, and environmental value. It must have not just a short-term view, it must have a medium and long-term view as well. So climate change is a really good example of this wider function of the SEC. SECs really need to understand the risks and opportunities that climate change is presenting for the company. And the SEC needs to play an active role in driving the appropriate strategy for dealing with climate change. And many companies, this is going to require very significant changes to its business plan, its whole value proposition, its supplier systems, its revenue generating systems, and its output. And so you'll see many companies now grappling with this need to move towards net zero. And to fundamentally, in many cases, really change their business models. So the SEC is very much more than a compliance function here. It actually has to lead the strategy for significant change over the short, medium, and long term. Failure to do this job well as a governance committee will significantly compromise the company's future. We know that. So the SEC needs to have people in that committee that are very well versed in the challenges of climate change and how it is going to impact that company in its supplier systems, in its output, and in the way it deals with the communities within which it operates. Now, given that context, there is a plethora of international reporting standards that are now starting to converge, and the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation is likely to become the global standard setter. And it seems that a number of the international reporting standards are converging with the IFRS to get this right. So, you know, this becomes a financial reporting requirement. It's not an on-the-side requirement. It's integral to the way in which companies will report their results and the values that they create. So the practical ideas that we've put forward in this paper are as follows, and I'll go through them fairly carefully, because I think this is where it will be useful to have some discussion with people who are on the call today. We wanted to be very practical about this and make it helpful, and I hope that it is. But of course, you know, as new ideas emerge, so we will, as a forum, evolve and develop further guidance. The first practical idea is to really have a hard look at your SEC composition. Make sure that there is cross-committee membership between the SEC and other board committees, and in particular with the audit and risk committees, or if you've got one audit and risk committee combined with that committee. And the reason we say this is that we have to have a cross-pollination of thinking between the people who worry about the finances of the company, the people who worry about risk, enterprise risk management in the company, and those who worry about the social and environmental and ethical impact of the company. And we found where there is this cross-pollination, that we have a much deeper understanding of the issues and a much deeper contribution to strategy formulation. All the Social and Ethics Committee members should also be members of at least one other board committee. What we found in the beginning was often SEC members would just be a little group on their own with really very little understanding of what was going on in the rest of the board committees. And we think that that's an opportunity lost. So we would advise that there is that cross-pollination by being members of other board committees as well. The Social and Ethics Committee membership diversity is extremely important. In order to understand diverse stakeholders, if this lack of understanding of stakeholders is a significant risk to all of our companies, and you'll see it even in the amendments to the Companies Act, where it would become statutory obligation to engage with shareholders around any dissenting view on the Social and Ethics Committee report. Then expertise in ESG issues is, of course, a requirement in the composition. And it would be wise to choose expertise that fits the core business of that company to ensure that these complex risks and opportunities can be addressed in a systematic way. It's not enough to have people with a general commitment to social and ethics matters. It really requires some understanding, particularly around climate change and environmental issues, to understand the impact of the company in that field. Then secondly, on SEC fees, I think with the surveys that Dion was referring to, we've found that Social and Ethics Committee members are not paid the same as other board committee members. And you'll see it in the annual reports as well of those companies that publish their fees paid to board members. We strongly recommend that fees are equalized. The Social and Ethics Committee job is equally important as every other committee. Then the third area is around the Social and Ethics Committee annual work plan. And we've provided quite a long list of issues which we believe should be on the annual work plan of every Social and Ethics Committee. This will, of course, need to be adapted and designed according to the requirements of that particular board and the company that it governs. But we do believe that all of these matters will need to be addressed by the Social and Ethics Committee. And it's important that the annual structure of the meetings, the number of meetings and the structure of the agenda for each meeting covers all of these in the course of a year. So I think this list goes to 2 slides. So I'll just start with the first thing. The first matter is around the strategy that the company needs to adopt arising from global and local sustainability trends and their implications. So it's quite important each year for the Social and Ethics Committee to get a strategic mapping of these trends that are impacting the company. And the Social and Ethics Committee can ask management to prepare this, can ask for specialized inputs to be provided to the committee. But the Social and Ethics Committee needs to have a really good handle on how these trends are impacting the company. And it must be global and it must be local. So for example, it's very useful to take the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which comes out every year. I know I've done this in a number of committees that I serve on, and that becomes a very useful reference point to say, how are these global risks impacting, how do they translate into our company reality. Now, that must feed through into business strategy for the company. It's not just a discussion for the Social and Ethics Committee. It has to feed back to the board, and the board as a whole needs to have a view on how these trends are going to be addressed in the company strategy as a whole. Then there must be regular reviews of these environmental and social impact analyses that are done around the company's activities. Social and Ethics Committee needs to have an honest and deeply analytical view of the impact of the company on the environment and the society within which it works. That has to be reviewed during the annual work plan. Then, of course, all the compliance controls and monitoring of the legal requirements and industry standards. And those have to be itemized and broken down, and the committee must have a good handle on exactly what compliance requirements are required for the company, and whether the company is doing its job. Then there's hotline monitoring, and most companies will have hotlines of various kinds on ethics issues, on grievance matters. And the Social and Ethics Committee needs to see those. It needs to ask for them, it needs to see them, it needs to analyze them, it needs to ask questions about what's arising and how management is dealing with those hotlines. Some of them are directed straight into internal audit, others are managed in the Human Resource Department and elsewhere. Either way, the Social and Ethics Committee must have a view. Then there are policy reviews, and most companies do policy reviews every 2 or 3 years, depending on what the policy is. There will be certain policies that are assigned to the governance responsibility of the Social and Ethics Committee. Those policy reviews need to be scheduled in the work plan, and they must be done properly. So the committee must ask management to say what it's done to review the policy, what new issues have come up in the review period that need to be incorporated, and how are those policies then aligning with the strategic view on where the company needs to be going on social and ethics matters. Then, of course, every company will be running environmental, social, and ethics projects and programs of various kinds, and the Social and Ethics Committee needs to have a running set of reports and disclosures on those, and be able to understand them and ask questions about them and give guidance where required. Every company has a corporate social investment program. The Social and Ethics Committee must oversee that and ensure that the funds are being spent as intended, and that they are achieving the outcomes that are intended, because often corporate social investment projects just bumble on in the background, and the board has a very scanty view of what's being done. So it's very important that the Social and Ethics Committee really understand how those funds are being utilized and whether they're achieving what they intended to achieve. The next issue is around stakeholder engagement monitoring. Every company ought to have a stakeholder engagement plan. It ought to map its stakeholders and understand the importance of those stakeholders to the company's strategic direction and its performance. And the Social and Ethics Committee must govern how that plan is unfolding, and must have a view on whether the stakeholders' concerns and expectations and reasonable expectations are being taken into account in the development of the business plan and the strategy of the company. Reputation analysis and reporting must also be done by the Social and Ethics Committee. So the committee needs to ask management to produce a regular update on how the company is perceived by its stakeholders, and have an understanding as to whether reputation is being proactively managed in an honest and correct manner. Then there will always be ethics investigations, and the annual work plan needs to make sure that these investigations are brought to the table of the Social and Ethics Committee, and that the committee has good oversight as to how those investigations are taking place, and give guidance on the consequence management of those investigations. Combined assurance is a big responsibility of the board, and the Social and Ethics Committee needs to give input to the combined assurance work of the board. And so it's important that the combined assurance framework, as approved by the board as a whole, then indicates what aspects of that combined assurance model need to be provided and supported by the work of the Social and Ethics Committee. So combined assurance must be on the agenda of the Social and Ethics Committee. Audit plans are often left with at the responsibility of the Audit Committee, of course, but we believe that the Social and Ethics Committee needs to give input to those annual audit plans. So it would be important for the draft audit plan to serve at the Social and Ethics Committee as well as at the Audit Committee, to ensure that any matters which the Social and Ethics Committee believe require attention by the internal audit team be put into the internal audit plan and be budgeted for and planned for in that audit. And then, of course, those elements that are required by the Social and Ethics Committee in the audit plan need to come back to the Social and Ethics Committee from the internal audit team, so that the committee can review the results of those audit reports. The next thing is around reporting. There will be various integrated report elements which the Social and Ethics Committee needs to provide and give guidance on. And in fact, the overall coherence and direction of the integrated report needs the attention of the Social and Ethics Committee, because the integrated report really has to demonstrate to stakeholders the integrated value that the company is creating. So it's not just the financials, it is the overall value that the company creates for society and the environment. Excuse me. And then, of course, many companies do reporting on the Global Reporting Initiative, the climate change reports, and all of those reports will need to be overseen by the Social and Ethics Committee. The Sustainable Development Goals, this is, I think, something that needs to be on the agenda of the Social and Ethics Committee annual work plan, is to say, if we take all the SDGs, how is the company holding up? What is the company contributing to the SDGs? And I think that should be reported in the integrated report, and it's something that the Social and Ethics Committee ought to be monitoring on an ongoing basis. Then we believe that the Social and Ethics Committee should also plan for expert briefings to be given to the committee on critical global and local trends that impact corporate sustainability for the company. Related to that, we've recommended board training, at least one joint board and executive training session per annum on the priority SEC matters and their impact on company strategy and performance. So the SEC needs to design the focus of that training and make sure that it happens. We think it's an important element of the annual work plan. And then reporting, the SEC report back to the board. We found that often the board agenda doesn't give sufficient time for the SEC reports and they get brushed over. So it's important that sufficient time is allocated in the board meetings for engagement on the SEC reports. And when the SEC reports to shareholders at the annual general meeting, that report must be a frank analysis of the ESG risks and opportunities and how the strategy is being adopted to address these. It mustn't gloss over the issues. It mustn't, just do a PR exercise. It really must tackle the challenges as they exist, and make the shareholders aware of the trade-offs that are having to be made by the company. The increasing emphasis on stakeholders is an important one that the SEC needs to pay attention to, because it really has to understand its stakeholders' needs and their interests and their legitimate expectations in order to make sure that the company's strategy is addressing these. And increasingly, we believe that the SEC has to have channels of communication open for stakeholder engagement where it's required. It's certainly not on an ongoing basis, but there might be occasions when the SEC has to engage with stakeholders directly. And I think that gets us to the end of the presentation on the paper. And we certainly look forward to engaging with you in the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue, for that very comprehensive overview. As Sue already indicated, we really would like to encourage you to put your questions to the panel. And I'm delighted to see that there are already a number of questions in the Q&A, but please make sure that you do put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. I will only be monitoring the Q&A. However, if you have any suggestions for future guidance papers, in other words, areas where you would like to seek more guidance from the Social and Ethics Committee Forum, please put that in the chat, and we will analyze that afterwards and see new areas of focus where more guidance is needed. Shepard, welcome. You have been welcomed already. Shepard, very experienced executive CEO, but also serving in a non-executive director capacity on a number of companies, both here and in our neighboring countries. And Shepard, I'm very glad that you can join us this morning. And I would like to get your perspective on this guidance paper, but specifically with your background as a non-executive director, but also as someone who chairs a social and ethics committee of a board, and also serving as a member of a social and ethics committee. What do you make of this guidance that Sue just shared with us?
Thanks, Prof. Good morning, all participants. The quick answer, Prof, is I fully endorse the paper that Sue has just presented. It takes the whole concept to the next level to give a lot of detail that was lacking in the past. So I'm fully supportive of it. And as you will see, the highlights that I'm going to give from the standpoint of an independent non-executive director are purely going to complement Sue's eloquent presentation, starting with the origin of the concept of SEC, which of course lies in the Companies Act 71 of 2008, Section 72, backed by Regulation 43. That, in fact, makes it a statutory committee, just like the Audit and Risk Committee, but quite often it is not perceived that way. Audit and Risk Committee is perceived as being at a higher level than the Social and Ethics Committee, yet they are both statutory committees with equal weight. Then the underlying motive for the establishment of SEC back then, which both the Prof and Sue have already alluded to, was in fact to advance the process of your socioeconomic equity and ethical culture and good corporate governance against the backdrop of the glaring inequality in SA, the so-called Gini coefficient, and also to advance the aims of the employment equity and be acts at the time when they had just been enforced. And thirdly, to show the importance of formal organizations to the total welfare of society. So it was then agreed that every employing organization plays a very critical role in the economic welfare of the entire society, not just its employees. And that has already been implied in Sue's presentation. The composition and membership of the committee, very much like Sue says, what is still failing at the moment is cross-membership. It is beginning to happen, but cross-membership is not failing only with respect to SEC, but it's failing with respect to all other committees. I do a lot of board evaluation for the IoDSA. This is one of the biggest shortfalls, that even cross-membership between the Human Resources Committee and ARC and any other committee, Capital Investments Committee, is still very lacking. So just the concept itself. And boards are beginning to talk about it, and some are beginning to introduce it. And as Sue said, the terms of reference generally provide for the majority of members of a SEC to be independent non-executive directors. And this is encouraged, and quite often it happens, but sometimes it happens with the people that do not have the correct skill set. They are normally just very good human resource management people, or sometimes corporate social investment experts, and so forth. And you also find it's the one committee that has a majority of members of management being part of it, particularly the HR and CSI staff and public relations staff and so forth. And the membership is often influenced by the terms of reference, which literally dictates appointing subject matter experts in the various areas to be able to, for the committee to be able to deliver on its mandate. In some cases, shareholders do nominate the members to show their commitment, but this is not often. Although, in fact, the legal basis of SEC says shareholders should be appointing the members. Some boards are now beginning to persuade and encourage shareholders to do so, and not leave that duty just solely to the board to do it. But the majority of boards still appoint social and ethics committee members instead of the shareholders. And I totally agree with the comment that Sue made about the board fees, that SEC members tend to be paid less. That is correct, and it is pitiable. But I'm happy to say there is actually now a sea change in that process. There's now a move towards equity of fees for all board members, because in the past, you may recall that audit and risk committee members generally were paid higher than any other committee members, because the assumption being they do a lot more work, and which is critical for the survival of the company in terms of annual financial statements, authenticity, and so on. But now there is a move towards paying board members more for attendance and contribution they make per sitting than to give them guaranteed or so-called retainer fee. And that sitting fee is now turning to be equalized. So I hope that in another couple of years, there will be total equity in terms of pay. Now let's turn to the scope of the SEC, which was also quite amply discussed by Sue. It is As the Prof said, the SEC concept was launched in 2012, 10 years ago. And before that, the human resources committees were tending to do the job, but of course it was not really central to their scope. So they did the best they could, but it was inadequate. So I would say that the scope of the Social and Ethics Committee is in fact still undergoing refinement and gathering of momentum. That's the phase that I'll put it at. In probably another 3 to 5 years, it would have crossed the Rubicon and running full steam on a defined basis. So at the moment, the scope tends to be enlarged almost every year, depending on what important issues come into the purview of organizations. And as we see it, it mostly comprises ethical culture and sustainability issues, CSI, economic development, corporate citizenship, environmental protection, health and welfare matters, public safety, especially in mining companies, consumer relations, because of the high pace of consumerism, and stakeholder management, compliance management, upholding the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that Sue talked about earlier, and the transformation, advancing the transformation process, and also attending to discrimination. And unfortunately, we are seeing this the discrimination rearing its head a lot more now, whether it's just direct discrimination or it's under the guise of xenophobia or any other phobia. So I can see that SEC is going to be quite busy going forward. Then the other one and last one is looking at the OECD corruption adherence, as well as the International Labour Organization decent work protocols. Now, the danger with this very wide scope is that it is too broad if one committee tries to take it all in. And therefore, then it loses the emphasis on a few tasks that should be tackled in depth and done well. So this is part of the refinement that I talked about earlier on, to say, how much can we do as one committee? And then can we prioritize what are the most critical issues to tackle now, and those to tackle in the medium term, and those to tackle in the long term. But of course, life normally presents issues with equal pressing urgency. So it's very difficult to do that prioritization, but I hope that social and ethics committees around are able to do it. Now then, I'll conclude with the common trends that I have noticed, which are being dealt with or needs to be dealt with. And some of them are favorable, some of them are not so favorable. Firstly, the companies that have low public interest score, they tend to combine the Social and Ethics Committee with the Human Resources Committee. Then my experience has been this tends to neutralize the social and ethics issues on the agenda, for the simple reason that Human Resources Committees were established much earlier than SEC, and therefore their agenda topics tend to dominate, and they are already established and clear, and SEC becomes just a hanger-on to piggyback on the HRC agenda. Then the Social and Ethics Committee is given lower status than, say, Audit and Risk Committee, as I have mentioned earlier on. But some boards are now consciously overturning this imbalance. Thirdly, shareholders overlook to demand social and ethics reports at the AGM, which is poor oversight on their part, and Sue spoke very adequately to this item. Fourth, loosely defined terms of reference of the Social and Ethics Committee undermine the effectiveness of the committee. And the terms of reference can be loosely defined in two ways at least. One is when it's too broad, as I mentioned earlier on, then it doesn't give a narrow direction to the members of the committee on what to do and when. Or it is just a badly composed terms of reference or charter. Then it doesn't give guidance either. Fifth, the act of decoupling Social and Ethics Committee from corporate governance best practice, e.g., conducting annual performance assessment on the Social and Ethics Committee, like any other committee of the board, this also reduces the effectiveness of the Social and Ethics Committee. And my experience is not many boards still or yet have conducted, have adopted the practice of undertaking annual performance appraisals for the board in totality, individual members, as well as the committees. So it is to be encouraged to do that because, as good governance practice indicates, this helps the committee to improve on its performance from year to year. Sixth, accepting soft and less quantitative targets for the Social and Ethics Committee, treating it too much as a soft peddling committee, well, which is looking after soft issues and not give the numerical quantitative targets, then that again reduces the effectiveness of the committee. 7, loading SEC with members with behavioral sciences and not hardcore business acumen. That also reduces the effectiveness of the committee. And as has been shown already in Sue's discussion, the Social and Ethics Committee now plays a very vital role in providing combined assurance in integrated reporting. And this is coming through. A number of boards are beginning to realize that, and they promote it. And the social and ethics functions should be and are beginning to be integrated into the business strategy and the business plan. If that doesn't happen, then the SEC again remains out on a limb and does not make the contribution that it is meant to. And going towards the end, on a number of boards now increasingly, the board chair and experienced senior directors are now sitting on the Social and Ethics Committee. Some of them, voluntarily on some of the boards, like myself, I quite prefer to sit on the SEC and Human Resources Committee because I know that is where most of the work of defining the functions of the committee and improving the delivery of the committee still is, as opposed to already established committees like ARC and so on. And the bottom line of what I've been saying, folks, is the Social and Ethics Committee fulfills a very important gap in good governance best practice. And in some companies, and also especially the companies that flow into the neighboring countries, they are beginning to export the whole concept of SEC to the neighboring countries. I sit on a number of boards, a bank that is headquartered here and operates in Zimbabwe, and so on. And we are already beginning to do that with the blessing of the parent company to find a way of exporting the concept of Social and Ethics Committee whether we integrate it into our human resources committees there, or we create some other platform for doing what a SEC should be doing. So that is indeed a very pleasing development. And I hope that it will continue to grow and grow. So I close by just saying Social and Ethics Committee is a very important platform that we should continue to see that we support and support it to make it grow, and we play our part to make it grow and grow correctly. Thank you.
Thank you, Shepard, and much appreciated. I just saw in the chat someone asked, do you have a formal version of what you've just said? I don't think you have a formal version, but the recording will be made.
I actually do, except that,
oh, you do?
Yeah, except I also added, a bit of padding from my experiences, but I have the format, yes.
Okay, and if you can share that with the Secretariat of the IOD, then they can also make that available. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Sue, can you also come on camera, please, so that we start the last hour of our session in panel format. And from what the two of you said, it's quite clear that there is a clear shift away from monitoring compliance to actually start focusing on the performance and the impact of companies. And of course, the moment that happens, the Social and Ethics Committee is starting to make a real difference. It's not a grudge buy then, or a grudge compliance, but it is a committee that really adds value and also contributes to value creation of organizations. There's a lot of questions that came in. Already at this point, I can say that we have more questions than we can handle. So I will start looking for patterns across the questions. And the one pattern that is already emerging has to do with the role of the Social and Ethics Committee versus the role of other committees, whether it be a Human Resource Committee, whether it is an Audit Committee or a Risk Committee. And I know from previous experience as well, this is a matter that really bothers people. Because on the one hand, we want to avoid duplication. We don't want 2 or 3 committees doing the same thing. But then it is very well possible for different committees to look at the same matter, but do very different things. And there is, for example, a question from Penny that I would like to put both to you, Sue, and to Shepard to just comment on that, dealing with the overlap between Social and Ethics Committee and the Audit and Risk Committee. And the question is, who is responsible for what and who has the last say? A question from Suleiman as well around the comment, I think, Sue, that you made about part of the annual work plan should be also oversight of ethics investigations. And what Suleiman is suggesting is that the Social and Ethics Committee should rather have a look at hotline reports and to overlook the trends, but leave the investigations to the Audit Committee. Can I ask you to respond to these 2 questions, but also in general say something about how do you see the role of the Social and Ethics Committee vis-a-vis the role of other committees of the board? And what are, in your mind, leading practice in structuring this relationship between various board subcommittees?
If I may kick off.
Yes, please, Shepard.
I would say that let's start with the role and then look at investigations and who should investigate what. I would actually say the role of the ARC versus SEC, they are well defined, except that the name compliance cuts across both of them. ARC is looking mainly at the financial integrity aspects, and whereas SEC is looking at all the ethical aspects. So as long as they look at it that way, there isn't too much of an overlap. However, when it comes to the investigation aspects, where I had the one question I was saying it should be left to the ARC only. It depends on the items or the topics for investigation. If they fall within the ambit of the of SEC, then SEC should investigate, because ARC would not have the competence to do that. But say if it's a forensic audit that is purely to look at financial affairs and that similar type of malfeasance, then the ARC should investigate. And I think that it's quite easy to clear it that way.
Okay, thanks, Shepard. That makes sense. Sue, your
Yes,
view on that?
Yes, Dion. I mean, I completely accept the view that we should be avoiding duplication and that we shouldn't waste resources in that way. But the SEC has a very particular lens on everything, and that's what we're looking to achieve. We want that lens on the whole of the business. Now, what it's going to require is that a lot of attention is paid by the company secretary, together with the chairs of the committees of the board, to the terms of reference of those committees right at the start, and a refresh of those terms every year. I would say it's important to say, are these terms appropriate for the job that we have before us this year? And if we need to divide up responsibilities slightly differently between the committees, then let's do that. So I think it does require some judgment by the chairs of the committees and the board as a whole, together with the guidance of the company secretary, to ensure that there's as little duplication as possible, but there's enough insight by every committee. So yes, committees are going to be looking at the same reports. I mean, I would still want the Social and Ethics Committee to have a view on the risk tolerance of the company with respect to Social and Ethics Committee matters. So you know, what are our levels of tolerance for disciplinary matters over the executives? I mean, it's an ethical issue as much as it is a human resource management issue. And that ethical lens has to be put onto the matter of risk tolerance. What is our and I saw there was a question around combined assurance. I mean, you know, combined assurance really is about getting the right amount of assurance that is appropriate to the risk appetite of the company as a whole. So the SEC needs to have a view on whether there is sufficient assurance being provided across all the assurance mechanisms and levels within the company to give comfort that the social, environmental, economic impact matters, ethical matters of the company are being correctly and properly assured. So yes, you know, I think we have to live with a certain amount of committees seeing the same reports. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because there's a different lens applied. And we're asking the SEC, the Social and Ethics Committee, to have that particular lens. I hope that helps in some way.
No, absolutely. It's also something that I cover in the program that we present through the IoD for Social and Ethics Committees. And one of the aspects that we look at is this potential overlap between the mandates of different committees. And I use the example there of something like a corruption report that typically could go to 3 different committees, exactly the same report going to the Social and Ethics Committee, but they look at it more from the perspective of, is our ethics management program and culture sufficient to deter corruption or to prevent corruption from occurring? While when that report goes to the Risk Committee, they look at whether corruption is a material risk for the organization and whether the risk mitigation is adequate. While if that report goes to the Audit Committee, they typically would decide whether there's a need for investigation into specific cases of corruption and whether that investigation should be done internally or whether it's so serious that we need some external investigation there. Shepherd, I would like to ask your view also on combined assurance. Sue already picked up on that as one of the questions. I think it was posed by Sue's namesake, another Sue, who asked the question about combined assurance. But also from your experience, how do you see the role of the SEC when it comes to combined assurance?
A very critical role that it plays. And in fact, just by definition, the concept of combined assurance encourages several service providers or service assurers than just one. So in fact, those assurance providers are a number of the different committees that sit on the board. So instead, the combined assurance concept encourages having more than 2 board committees look at the same subject and give assurance on it. That is the whole concept of combined assurance. So I personally encourage it. And on boards that I chair, for instance, I'm now quite encouraging a lot of cross membership to start with, as well as the several committees of the board looking at a particular investigative report from their perspective and say, do they pick up anything that has been left out by the committee that investigated, and what do they add? And I borrowed this actually from my days when I worked for Shell. If you had, and all these big oil companies do that because safety is critical on refineries and particularly offshore oil drilling rigs. And if you have a terrible accident there, fire accident, explosion, you will have at least 3 investigating committees. The safety committee, human resources will go, and then the procurement will go, and everybody else. So you get 4 different reports that will all go to the board, and then the board will be more informed to make a call on what happened and what should be done to prevent it happening in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I recently had an interesting conversation with Ansi Romolo, who's the current chair of the King Committee, who made the interesting comment to say that for her, combined assurance already starts with reports to the Social and Ethics Committee, so that when a staff member or executive reports something to the Social and Ethics Committee, she says it is important that there should always be a management comment to that. In other words, how do we as management perceive of this report? Are we doing certain things about that? Do we see it as a material risk? So it already starts there, but obviously it goes much further. And I find that is probably one of the biggest untapped potentials of social and ethics committees, that they can very materially enhance the confidence that we can put in the information that is reported both internally and externally. Because if that information that ultimately ends into our external reports, integrated reports, sustainability reports, annual reports, if that information is vetted on an ongoing basis by the Social and Ethics Committee, then we can have much more confidence in what we ultimately report to external stakeholders. Sue and Shepherd, and maybe Sue, you can go first on this one. There are also a number of questions revolving around ESG reporting. There are questions, for example, by Vujelva about where should the ESG expert report to? Should it be to the Finance Committee? Should it be to the Social and Ethics Committee? Where should it be reported to? But if we can also take it a bit broader than that, Sue and Shepherd, how do you see the role of the Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to the ESG reporting, but also monitoring the ESG performance of organizations? I know you both just touched on that, but can we do a bit of a deeper dive there about how you see that?
Okay. Thanks, Dion, and thanks for the questions. Look, I think every company will have a different approach to where the ESG management function sits. I mean, we do have a lot of examples where ESG sits in a strategy executive function, and sometimes in a risk management function. I don't think that we would want to prescribe what's best. I think that depends on the organization of the company itself. But whoever the executive is who is responsible for the ESG work, the management work of the company, that executive would need to be able to report regularly to the Social and Ethics Committee. So, that would be the reporting line. If there's a special executive for that function, then so be it on that score. I think on the reporting side, the board needs to take a view with input from management as to which reporting standards it wants to use, which are most appropriate for the company, and which are most appropriate for its stakeholders. So there's some statutory reporting obligations which are non-negotiable, but there are many standards that are out there for reporting, and different companies choose different reporting methodologies. I think the real issue for the Social and Ethics Committee is the integrity of the underlying data that informs those reports. And I think that's where the Social and Ethics Committee needs to apply its mind, because often our data systems in companies are not adequate for the task. And sometimes the reporting is a bit fudged. Sometimes the data sets don't have the integrity that they need. And I think social and ethics committees need to be very alert to the quality of the underlying data, and to engage with management in a very detailed way on whether that data can withstand scrutiny, because the integrity of that data really is becoming very, very important. I think, I think many of our companies are suppliers or sell into European markets. And just last year, the European Parliament issued a directive that companies in Europe are going to have to account for the environmental, social, and governance behavior of their suppliers, not just their own behavior, but the behavior of their suppliers. Now, the reporting requirements on that are going to become more and more onerous, not less so. And dare we be in a position where our data doesn't have the integrity to withstand the scrutiny of those regulators, of the companies that are buying our products? And more so on the climate front, because the carbon footprint of the supplier companies is going to become under scrutiny. And we better have our ducks in a row. We better know what we're talking about. Our data must be sound. So the Social and Ethics Committee really has a huge responsibility to ensure the integrity of that reporting. And that's the point that I would like to emphasize, rather than which standard we're applying. I would rather that we absolutely scrupulous about the quality of our data.
Thanks, Sue. And it's a very important development, that one in the EU, one that we need to be on the lookout for. And I think it's part of a trend that we see, because we've seen something similar with anti-corruption legislation, that companies, especially your multinationals, are also held accountable for corruption in their supply chain. And now there's a similar development around impact on environment and society as well. And I think the old adage that says you cannot outsource your immorality to your suppliers is becoming not only a moral principle, but also legal practice more and more. Shepard, I would also like to hear your view on how you see the role of the Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to ESG reporting and oversight.
Yeah, I think Sue has done an excellent job in giving, a very good detail. So I'll just cap it up by saying simply the you may call the individual the executive responsible for social and ethics. Their reporting line should be exactly the same as the chief audit executive. Chief audit executive has direct line to the chair of the audit and risk committee, and through that to the board. And some, in certain cases, totally avoids the CEO. So the same should happen with the executive responsible for social and ethics. They have a direct line to the chair of the social and ethics committee, and through that to the board, and onwards to the shareholder, depending on the gravity of the ESG matter that is at hand. And on the actual reporting content, again, I agree with Sue, and I'll simply say, and I always believe that produce a report that is fit for purpose that is appropriate to the target audience that you are addressing it to. And then that gives you the upper hand in communicating fluently.
Okay, thank you for that. And of course, if we look at the subject matter of ESG, in other words, environmental, social, and governance performance and reporting, it's clear that a lot of that, especially around the E and the S, around the environmental impact and also the social impact on both the economy, the workplace, the people working for the organization, but also our clients and the communities in which we operate. That is part and parcel of both the statutory mandate, but also what King 4 recommends should be within the mandate of the committee. And even some of the G, the governance stuff, because part of your governance reporting is also reporting on your ethics and your values and your anti-corruption. And all of that also sits within the mandate of the committee. So it's quite clear that the Social and Ethics Committee has to play a central role there. But it will always be in collaboration with other committees and without duplicating. There were also a number of questions that were more of a technical nature. For example, Tsehu Fatsu asked, what are the number of annual meetings required for Social and Ethics Committee? And the short answer is that there are no specific requirement there in the Companies Act and regulations. But I think this is where the Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey becomes quite useful, because there we can see what leading practice is. And the leading practice clearly now is that these committees meet 4 times per year. In other words, your normal quarterly cycle of meetings like most other board committees. Obviously, when a company is going through crisis, then it starts looking very differently. And we've seen it, for example, Shepherd, your example of an accident in a mine happening. All of a sudden, there's a whole lot of safety and health issues. And then we see it all of a sudden increasing. And in our survey, we have seen that one company met in 2020 16 times the Social and Ethics Committee. And in the 2021 survey, one company met, or the Social and Ethics Committee rather, met 12 times. But this is in times of crisis. So the normal rhythm is a quarterly rhythm. In a similar matter, Matefu asked the parameters for companies required to have social and ethics committees in terms of company size and company turnover. Well, there it's about your public interest score. We know that there are certain categories of companies required to have social and ethics committees, and they are: number 1, all state-owned companies; secondly, all listed companies; but the third category is companies with a public interest score of 500 points or higher in any 2 of the last 5 years. And that public interest score consists of 4 factors that all contribute, and they are the number of employees, the annual turnover of the company, the debt of the company, and your number of beneficial shareholders, or your number of members in the case of non-profit companies. Okay, there's a question by Rochelle. And Sue, I think it also comes back to something that you mentioned in passing. And Rochelle asked, who needs to determine the Social and Ethics Committee's terms of reference? And who is responsible for streamlining its terms of reference and focusing them on the relevant issues? I think a very important question for all social and ethics committees. And can I ask both of you to comment on that, starting with Sue this time?
Yes, thanks, Dion. It's a very important question. Look, my response is that the chair of the Social and Ethics Committee must take responsibility for leading the preparation of the terms of reference and recommending that terms of reference to the board for approval. The company secretary, of course, plays a role in that, because the historic terms of reference all feed into the formulation of the terms of reference. But the chair of the Social and Ethics Committee must take responsibility for ensuring that that terms of reference is correct and fit for purpose. In doing so, that person must engage with the chairs of the other board committees and with the board chair, him or herself as well. So I think it's just an annual task of that chairperson to make sure that that terms of reference is correct.
Shepherd?
Yeah, absolutely correct. I'll just add that, and I'm sure Sue implied that, that is not the chair that carries the can on their own and do it on their own. Is the chair that leads or marshals the efforts of their committee to do it. And sometimes they even go outside to get a professional expert to make input. And that I actually encourage, because of the newness of the whole concept of ESG in particular. You need to go outside and get some expert input and consolidate it, then take it to the whole board for approval.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. A few years ago, I called a meeting of chairs of social and ethics committees at the IoD, and we talked about what makes some social and ethics committees more effective than others. And it was interesting that the consensus that came to the fore in that meeting, and all those organizations where there was quite an effective social and ethics committee with good traction and good legitimacy, were those social and ethics committees who engaged on an annual basis with the company strategy and said, how is the work of this committee tied to the strategic objectives and the purpose of this company? And I think if we look at all the things, and Sue, I think you've demonstrated that it's quite a wide array of matters that can be, and in some cases must be, on the radar of a social and ethics committee. I think when you start looking at your mandate through the lens of our company's purpose and our company's strategic objectives, then some things within your mandate start jumping out as being more material to you than other matters. And it's typically those matters that you will give more attention to during the run of your cycle of social and ethics committee meetings, and those things that will appear more regularly on your annual work plan. So I think it really is a matter of, when it comes to how do you focus on what matters, to always marry the work of the committee with the purpose and the strategy of the organization. And then you would see that some of the matters in your mandate becomes more equal than others, and you will spend more time on them. I noted that there are at least 3 questions dealing with social and ethics committees in smaller companies, and specifically in SMEs. And I hinted to that in the introduction this morning, that King 4 says not only those 3 categories of companies, namely state-owned companies, listed companies, and public interest companies, should have social and ethics committees, but all organizations should govern their social and ethics performance. Can I ask both of you, Shepherd, starting with you this time, on advice specifically for your SMEs. And if I can read this question by Shadrach, who says, the SEC, according to the Companies Act, is compulsory for certain companies, such as JSE-listed companies and state-owned companies. I would like to know, what is your attitude or view in small to medium-sized companies establishing social and ethics committees? Voluntary? Do you think cost and benefits will be optimal for SMMEs to establish them according to your articulation this morning? Otherwise, I commend you for the great and valuable work you have done on the SEC. Thank you, Shadrach. But let's hear first Shepherd's view on that, and then Sue, I would also like to get your take as well.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I alluded to it in my presentation that companies with a low public interest score, which into which the SMEs fit, quite often do combine SEC work with the Human Resources Committee, and they tend to have one committee dealing with both. And then the advice that I always give is for them to ensure that human resources agenda does not dominate the social and ethics agenda. If they can balance the two, then fair and good, let it happen. That tends to be. And the reason why it happens is they do not have boards that are big enough to be able to allocate members to too many committees. So then it's prudent to combine committees that are like for like, such as HRC and SEC, and have them to deliver on both scores.
Sue?
Yes, I mean, I think that smaller companies just have to take a very pragmatic view on what is the most practical way in which they can ensure that their companies are meeting environmental, social, and governance objectives. So the board would have to start with a discussion on what are our priorities, where are our top risks in these areas, what is the level of risk exposure, what are our opportunities. So start with those questions and try to get a handle on how that translates for your company in your circumstances with your stakeholders and with your shareholders. And if the size of the challenge is big enough and complex enough, then it would be very much worth your while to establish a dedicated social and ethics committee. If the size and complexity of the challenge is something that can be managed within your current governance structures and with the current board as established, and you could add certain additional responsibilities to existing committees, then that's the decision of the board. And I think it will always be a pragmatic decision as to how to weigh up the costs of running an additional committee with the benefits of having that additional committee. And it has to revert back to the question of the risks and opportunities to which your company is exposed. So there isn't a one size fits all answer, Dion. I think it really is up to the board of that company to make an informed and careful decision about this. But the important thing is to make that decision and not just to avoid it and say, look, this is too much, it's too complicated, it's going to cost us too much. Have the conversation, look at the issues, challenge yourselves, make sure that you've answered the tough questions, and then make the decision.
Okay. Shepherd, did you put a hand up there? Do you want to add something further there?
Oh, no. It must be, purely coincidental. Definitely not.
Okay. And Sue, I totally agree with you, because matter of the fact is your sustainability as an organization depends to a large extent, amongst many other things, also on your social and ethics performance. And these things can either help you to sustain yourself, but also the environment in which you operate, or it can put you at risk or put your environment, which you need to exist, also at risk. So in that sense, I think it's almost commonsensical that if you want to govern any organization and you are seeking the best interest of that organization, you can't take a very narrow look and only look at financial performance and not also at your social and ethics performance. And I also agree, there's no one size fits all. Malcolm, in the meantime, in the chat, I also asked whether this applies also to the non-profit sector and to social impact organizations. And I would say exactly the same applies there. And we can see it especially in your non-profit sector, that more and more your funders of so-called NGOs, they are also looking at not only at the financial performance and sustainability of organizations that they fund, but also at their social and ethics performance and at their governance. In other words, they also apply an ESG lens when they decide, is it worthwhile funding this organization or not? There were also questions by Jan and Tsego on especially those companies who are caught by their public interest score. And now all of a sudden they are required to have a social and ethics committee, but they have no non-executive directors on their board. Do you perhaps have any idea, Shepherd, on how to deal with that? Or do you perhaps have personal experience? Because we know the Companies Act says that there should be a minimum of 3 members on your social and ethics committee, and at least one of them must be a non-executive director and must have been so for the last 3 financial years. Do you perhaps have any experience of that, Shepherd, on how to deal with that?
Well, fortunately, I don't have experience of that, but I have a view on that.
Okay, let me hear.
For starters, for a company not to have any independent non-executive directors, that's a serious failure on its part, because then it's a club of friends, internal friends for that matter, who pat each other on the back and lead each other into the bush. So that is not that is poor governance to start with. So then it will certainly be punished for not doing that. Then how do you resolve it? Resolve it by first going out to seek at least non-executive directors, but ideally independent non-executive directors. Yeah. And then at least one of those should then take leadership of the social and ethics concepts in the organization, including leading the committee.
Yeah, and I think we all know that that King 4 is actually pushing it much further, because King 4 says, well, yeah, the law requires, the Company Act requires that there must be 3 members. It stipulates that only one of them must be a non-executive director, which allows for the situation where you now can have a social and ethics committee with a majority of executives. In other words, you now have managers marking their own homework, which is bad practice. And therefore, King 4 recommends that the majority of members of your social and ethics committee should be non-executive directors. And if we look at the company's amendment bill, it is going in the same direction. In other words, it is following the King 4 lead in this regard. And therefore, it is important for these companies, Shepherd, to take your advice seriously, as not only as probably a legal requirement in future, but also as good governance practice to have sufficient independence in the governance of your organization. And I think there's something, I'm under correction here, in the Companies Act that says your board should be so compiled that you can comply with the specific requirements for establishing your statutory committees, like your audit committee and your social and ethics committee. Donfrey has a question, and we are back at this whole issue, which seems to be a recurring theme this morning, about the relationship between different committees. And this time it's about remuneration. And now you would all probably recall that in King 4, there was a recommendation in that report that part of the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee should also be to look at the fairness of remuneration. And once again, the moment that you talk remuneration, you think about the REMCO, the Remuneration Committee. So the question here is, how would the Social and Ethics Committee approach the topic of remuneration versus the REMCO? The REMCO would deal with the detail of remuneration in terms of the REM policy and implementation, but in terms of King 4, fair remuneration and employment equity is the oversight of the SEC. How could the approach of the SEC to fair remuneration oversee their mandate but not cause confusion in terms of its mandate? Sue, Shepherd, who want to go first on this one?
I will attempt it first. Again, it's a question of shared mandates here, and that happens often now in many committees, and that's in pursuit of the combined assurance concept, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's in fact encouraged. REMCO does its part and goes out to do surveys in the marketplace on the correct levels of remuneration and recommends it to the board. And then Social and Ethics Committee, it is looking at the fairness and standardization of that right across the board. And it doesn't only restrict it to board committees, but throughout the organization. And it is allowed to do that. So yes, there is, if the board, particularly the board chairman, is sufficiently magnanimous and strict that, listen, we will allow both committees to walk in their lane and do their work. Then they will do their work and cross-feed with the final result, which is always, at the end of the day, the board is the final arbiter and referee. So I see no problem at all in the Social and Ethics Committee getting involved in the fairness aspect of remuneration.
Sue?
Yes, I mean, I can only add to what Shepherd has said, Dion, and I completely agree with it. My experience is that the HR committee or the REMCO does the heavy lifting, as Shepherd says. It does the reviews of the market trends. It looks at the history of the company in terms of the remuneration trends that have happened. And it proposes a position. And then it will ask the Social and Ethics Committee to review that from the lens of the Social and Ethics Committee. So the Social and Ethics Committee needs to say, what are our stakeholders saying about remuneration? What are the global trends in respect of remuneration? Are we being fair? Are we applying our policies appropriately in this adjustment? And it's just the lens that the Social and Ethics Committee has to bring to the work that is done by the REMCO. So they're not doing the same job. They've got a different lens on the same matter. That's the way I would see it.
Yeah,
and both those views then come to the board. The board as a whole then makes the decision on the remuneration policy for that period.
In other words, it's about the ethical lens that you put over the work of the REMCO. It's not about redoing the work of REMCO. It is putting an ethical lens and posing the ethical question, is it fair and responsible the way in which we remunerate? And we see a similar practice with investment decisions as well, that at least in some of our financial institutions, recommendations by an investment committee also goes to the Social and Ethics Committee, and they put the ethical lens on that investment decision and ask, is this an ethical or responsible investment? So in that sense, it's not duplication. There was a question from Non Tsikelelo, Shepherd, directed to the comment that you made specifically about the chairperson of the board serving on the Social and Ethics Committee. And the person is not quite sure why it's a good idea to have the chairperson of the board serving on the Social and Ethics Committee.
Okay. Firstly, it's not a must, but it's a matter of preference. For instance, I quite prefer sitting there, but not chairing the committee, but sitting as a member of the committee. It gives me a very good feel of the public perception of the ethics content of the organization, and it also forces me to think hard and deep about the ethical issues as they are discussed on the committee. So, but it's not a must, but it gives it gravitas. So you find human nature is the same all over. If a chairman of the board sits on a particular committee, that committee has a lot more gravitas perceptually than other committees.
And Shepard, if I can follow up on that, how do you feel about the CEO being made either a member or then at least a standing invitee of the committee?
Yeah, that is normally the case. You'll find the CEO on the REMCO or HRC as well as the SAC. They are ex-officio members. The main reason being, they are the most apt and correct source of information about what is happening in the organization. And but reciprocally, they are the person that presses the button for implementation of all decisions of the SEC. They are the person that make things happen in the organization.
Sue, anything to add to that?
No, I fully support that view, Dion. Nothing further to add.
Yeah, and I must say that the social and ethics committees that I chair myself, if at least the CEO is not a standing, is not a member of the committee in terms of the terms of reference, I would always insist that that person is always there, then at least a standing invitee, because I totally agree with your sentiment. Colleagues, we are running out of time. So I think we are going to take a last question, and then I'll ask both of you after we've taken that question to just share some final words of wisdom. But it's Barry, I think from Cape Town, who is saying, currently there's globally and in King 4 increased focus and talk of stakeholders, which of course also include shareholders. However, if we look at the statutory reporting for the SEC, it is restricted to shareholders. In other words, there's only a requirement that the Social and Ethics Committee should report to shareholders once a year at the annual general meeting of the company. And Sue, as you indicated, if the Companies Amendment Act would come would be turned into reality, then there will be a vote by shareholders on the report of the Social and Ethics Committees. Now, Barry says, I would have thought it should be to stakeholders by way of a public media publication. At present, the statutory requirements make shareholders the primary audience. Exclamation mark.
Yes.
I think it's a crucial, important point that Barry is raising here, and I would love to hear your comments on this.
Mm. Shall I kick off, Dion?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I think most companies now know that they do need to account to all their stakeholders. I mean, I think King 4 makes that very clear. Integrated reporting makes it very clear, and in fact, all the sustainability reporting standards are around disclosures to your stakeholders, not only to your shareholders. So that's the first thing to say. Look, the Companies Act is very much focused around the shareholder reporting, and even the amendments that are being proposed in respect of the Social and Ethics Committee reports are in respect of the shareholders. Whether that will be changed in the public commentary on the Companies Act amendments, we'll wait and see. But I don't think that there are any listed or large companies that wouldn't make their reports publicly available to all their stakeholders, and they do. So integrated reporting is targeted at all the stakeholders. So I'm not concerned that the stakeholders don't see the reports. They do. They are publicly available. It's just that the statute doesn't require it.
Yeah, I agree that, in fact, the general practice now, as Sue says, the statute does not command companies to do that, but general practice, including sitters, for instance, is that they now produce at least 2 versions of an annual report. What you might call version 1, the very complex one and large for the shareholders and investors, then the less complex, which is fit for purpose for the other stakeholders, so that they can understand it without too much clutter. So there's, I think it's beginning to happen. I can understand why the Companies Act would restrict it to shareholders, because being a statute, if it just opens it up to say stakeholders, then it's forced to have to define who are the stakeholders, and in case the matter goes to court, and that becomes extremely difficult. But shareholders, yes, those can be defined. They are in the shareholders agreement and in the MOI.
Mm. Yeah, and Barry, you might be interested to know that when in the King Committee we discussed the proposed amendments to the Companies Act, it was actually a point raised that it probably isn't a good idea to give shareholders a binding vote on the Social and Ethics Committee report, because shareholders don't necessarily have the best interest of the company at heart. They might have their own personal and even selfish interest at heart, and not the best interest of the company and its stakeholders. And therefore it was suggested that they should not be in a position to have a binding vote and say, for example, we are rejecting the Social and Ethics Committee report because the company spends too much on social investment or on mitigating climate change, and we want rather to see that money flowing to us in the form of dividends. So in that sense, it is something that I think we will talk a lot about in coming years, about the role of stakeholders and how do we balance that power that currently sits in the hand of shareholders and give stakeholders more voice. And you would all know that there are probably still more amendments to the Companies Act coming in terms of stakeholder representation on boards even. So I think this is a space that we need to watch very closely, because we might see more developments in this regard. Okay, so let's wrap up. Shepard, a final word from you, and then we'll give Sue the final word.
Right, probably just 2 things. Encouragement to Social and Ethics Committee members that don't be browbeaten because you're the new kid on the block in terms of board committees. You should punch above your weight in order to entrench your position. And secondly, you should continue to be trailblazers and be highly creative of focusing on combined assurance. How do you add value to the board? And you have to sell your position and sell it courageously in order to earn your place in the sun.
Thanks, Shepard. Sue, final word from you.
Thanks, Dion, and thanks, Shepard, as well for that very important word of encouragement. I do think that social and ethics committees need to take their role extremely seriously, to really pay attention to those terms of reference by which they do their job. Make sure that their annual work plans cover all of the key bases that need to be covered, and stay up to date with the global trends and the local trends on sustainability, and think about how they feature and apply in reality in your company, so that you really are internalizing the external environment into the strategy of your company. And if that means you need to do scenario planning, for example, around what the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requires, that's detailed work, and it's hardcore work. It involves figures and financials and understanding the impact of these huge global trends on the future sustainability of the company for which you are responsible. So take that job seriously. It's not a fluffy job, and it's not just a compliance ticking job. It's a job that will shape the direction and future of your company, and therefore is extremely important. So hang in there. Put your heads down and keep going. I support Shepard's view. Take your job seriously and go for it. You are being listened to more and more. I do believe there's a material shift in the way in which boards are understanding these mandates that the Social and Ethics Committee holds. So thank you very much for your time today. It was a pleasure to discuss with you. And the questions were great. I've been reading them. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but really, really insightful views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue and Shepard. I was just keeping one eye on the chat, and there's lots and lots of appreciation for insights and also for practical guidance. It is sincerely appreciated. But we also appreciate everyone who attended and everyone who participated. We had lots of activities in the Q&A and in the chat. Thank you for enriching our experience this morning and enriching our conversation. And please, just the invitation again, if there are any areas that you would like the Social and Ethics Committee Forum to contribute more guidance in the form of guidance papers or seminars or whatever other form we do it, please let us know. And be on the lookout for the next paper that deals with the role of the Social and Ethics Committee on overseeing the ethical culture of organizations. So with that, we formally end this webinar. Thank you for attending, and hope to see you at one of the next webinars again. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.